Hello, and welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. I'm a Micro Four Thirds enthusiast, it seems. In today's video, we'll have a look at the Olympus E-PL2. Anyways, before we get started, it's tangent time. This was another device that I wasn't exactly looking for, but I saw an ad pop up again on my local marketplace, and it showed the E-PL2 and this Olympus 17mm f2.8 all in for 80 Canadian buckaroos. That's about 60 USD. And just as an FYI, the 17mm f2.8 on its own still routinely sells for around 100 USD on the internet. Or at least, thereabouts that price. So it seemed like a no-brainer, and I picked it up. So let's get into it. What is the Olympus E-PL2, other than this camera right here? Well, the E-PL2 is a Micro Four Thirds camera, announced in early January 2011. This was an entry-level mirrorless camera made to bridge point-and-shoots and DSLR users. The camera itself features a 12.3 megapixel live MOS sensor, and that's a 2x crop sensor. It features an 11-zone autofocusing system, and that system is contrast detect only. The ISO range of the E-PL2 is 200 to 6400, with the expansion option giving you ISO 100. Metering is done using a 324-zone system, and the shutter is good for 60 seconds to 1/4000th of a second. The camera shoots at 3 FPS and can do so for about 10 RAWs. The camera has no EVF, so for composition, it's done using the rear display, which is a 3-inch unit, and it features 460K dots. Memory on the camera is SD cards, and the camera actually features both sensor shake for dust removal and an inbuilt image stabilization system, or IBIS for short. The the mass with a battery and memory comes in at 362 grams, a little over 1/3 plana. When the camera was introduced, it was sold as a kit with the 14 to 42mm kit lens, and that came out to roughly 599 USD. That's about $840 in future money, or $1,140 in northern winter bucks. And if you think about it, $840 for a kit, that's about as much money as what the Fujifilm XM5 costs right now, with that kit costing about $60 more. Issues to look out for if you're looking for an E-PL2. There's really only one thing, and that's that the IBIS unit on these things can fail. And it's not just the E-PL2, it's a bunch of the E-PL series cameras. Primarily, they're the ones that use the older IBIS system, which I think is like a 3-axis as opposed to a 5-axis. These can suffer failure, which is what happened to my E-PL5, which some of you may remember. I made a video on that. Now, again, the E-PL2 can't suffer the same issue. And you can see it display on the camera if you power the camera on, and you get an amber alert that indicates that there's a IBIS problem. It'll basically flash for a bit and it won't go away. And what happens is usually one of two things. One, you might have the IBIS gear just having skipped a position and it isn't able to index properly. In that case, all you need to do is kind of like reset it and you're good to go. However, it does seem that more likely than not, the main driving gear on the IBIS axis is just going to have shattered. Now, the gears are made out of nylon and they're just press fitted onto their main driving shafts. And so, over time, they get brittle and they just crack or shatter and no longer, are able to drive the IBIS. I'll link to the video that I did on my E-PL5, and you can get an idea what the repair is like if you want to investigate that. Alternatively, you could just live with the failed IBIS. It kind of sucks, but that might be a one way to get one of these for super duper cheap. shooting with the E-PL2 look, operation, and feel. So before we get started with the actual operation, I just want to quickly have a chat about styling. And I know this part is subjective, but look at it. It's quite pretty. Now, just in case you weren't aware, when Olympus first entered the mirrorless world, they released the EP1. It was a very beautiful, solid first entry into the mirrorless world. Now, it was still kind of aimed at as a budget model, but soon after they released that, they released the E-PL1, which was their budget-est model. And it was actually considerably different than the EP1. So if you remember the EP1, it was considered quite beautiful, very nice looking, very premium. The E-PL1, however, looked very plastic, looked really different from the EP1, but it was actually pretty similar. The hardware was basically the same, and what they'd basically done to make the product differentiation was cheapen the body and change the ergonomics to make the EP series more in line with point and shoot cameras, and the EP make it a little closer to a full-fledged SLR with command dials and things like that. Basically, the EP was supposed to be a little more premium, so they had nicer controls, and the EPL was less premium, worse controls, and cheaper materials. Now, that being said, the feedback from the E-PL1, I think, was a bit harsh. So when came time to do the E-PL2, they more or less styled it after the EP2. And that is a good call because I think this is a very handsome camera. And basically, what you ended up having was a camera that was styled to look like the more premium camera, but with controls that were more restricted to make it fit within the EPL product line. But I think personally that it worked out overall for the EPL series moving forward, as it always then ended up looking quite nice, and at times kind of made the EP series feel a bit redundant. So maybe this worked a little too well. But again, this part's more this is what I think of the styling. On to the operation and feel. So this is, as I said, an entry-level camera, but in hand, it feels quite good. The camera has a pretty nice dense feel, and it overall feels like it's well built. It's got a combination of metals and plastics that compose the body, and it is admittedly less metal than the EP series, and the grip itself on this camera, it's quite small, but I personally find it is reasonably comfortable. Most of my fingers actually fit, all of my fingers fit on the grip, which is kind of nice. And this part is a rubberized finish, which also adds to the holdability. On the back, where, the screen is and all your buttons and things, there's a bit of a contour here where you can rest your thumb. And it does so without interfering with the buttons, which is quite thoughtful. So, being a small camera, when it's paired with the Micro Four Thirds smaller primes, this camera is truly very compact. I'm using it with the OG 17mm f2.8 pancake, and I think it is super duper very nice. That being said, if you have one of the larger pro lenses, it does end up being a bit ungainly since those lenses tend to be very large and the camera will then kind of feel unbalanced. Some of you may know that I have a soft spot for EVFs, and I really like cameras that tend to have an EVF on there, and looking at the E-PL2, it does not. So all the composition is done on the rear screen. And to add to the insult, it's not articulating or tilting, it's just fixed, so it's a bit inflexible. However, the rear LCD is not super bad, and it's okay in daylight. Now, if you're used to modern panels, it's probably not going to look super good, but it's all right. Now, there is a EVF option that you could add to it, but this ends up adding a lot of cost to the camera. But we'll get back to this later on. Now, before we move on though, I will say that a pro with this particular camera's live view is that it's actually reasonably responsive. In low light, you actually don't notice the camera dropping the frame rate too often, which at the time was pretty common to see on mirrorless cameras or DSLRs in live view. Now, I know you're not gonna get the camera to do like a 240 frame playback or, refresh rate on the LCD, but again, in really poopy light, it is quite nice. Like in where I'm shooting right now, where there aren't lights pointed at me, it is just dark, and the camera's frame rate is quite solid. So, good on you, Olympus. Now, let's talk about controls next. Sadly, this is where this camera sometimes falls short. Part of that is, again, due to the product differentiation between the EP series and the EPL series. So Olympus did a couple things, set those two lines apart. Aside from the extra letter on the EPL series, the EPL series, as I said, has less premium build, more plastics, which is fine, no biggie to me. However, the next thing they did was a little more critical, and that is with the simplification of controls. With the EP series, you usually get one proper command dial, and that's actually usually placed right here where the movie record button is. And then you get this D-pad combo wheel. And with the EPL series cameras, you only get this D-pad combo wheel thingy. And I'm not a big fan of them. It's definitely not as nice as a command dial, but it generally works okay. It's just not as intuitive, and it adds a little more, more button presses to operations that would normally just be a scroll of a command dial. Here is an example. If you try to adjust the exposure setting, then you press up, and while that is happening, you can roll this command wheel thingy. There we go. Oh. There we go. And when you're done, you actually have to press in the OK button to acknowledge, or do a half press of the shutter and it'll change it. But it's just something that adds another step to changing a setting that should normally be quite quick. But enough pooping on the combo dial thingy, because really everything else is fairly well placed. The mode dial itself is good, and it has fairly good clickies when you scroll it through. Not the mode dial, the command wheel. This mode dial is in a good position, and it clicks fairly nicely when you scroll through, and you're not really likely to knock it when you're operating the camera. There's, however, no locking switch for the mode dial, which I think is perfectly fine. Now, another nice thing is that, again, because this camera is so small, most of the controls are clustered where your thumb can reach it, which is quite nice. Again, with the exception being the pop-up flash, which does that. Now, with all this combined, the experience of shooting the E-PL2 is reasonably well executed. Now, when you're actually manipulating your shutter speed or aperture, the dial wheel does work okay. The one thing that I did kind of find annoying is just, the excessive amount of clickies that you had to do to manipulate things and acknowledge due to the fact that there's only one control wheel. But again, not the worst in the world, and you get used to it fairly quick. Now, one thing I did like was the implementation of the quick menu. Basically, you press the OK button in the center, and you can navigate up and down your options, and then either move your dial to manipulate or go left and right on whatever things you need or want to change. Additionally, you can swap your display out on the live view for a bunch of other various displays by tapping the info button right here. And you can get something like your live histograms or a exposure comp preview. Honestly, it's fairly solid. Now, one thing that's kind of odd about this camera is that it doesn't have a built-in gyro, which means that if you do one of these and take a photo, the camera will not auto-correct the position, or will not tilt the photo to the correct position when you open up your JPEG on your computer. But hey, this is only the second generation of mirrorless cameras, so, can't have everything. Now, when it comes to the camera's menus, it is pretty Olympus-y, so it's all right. Navigation is fairly easy. You basically go down the categories, and then you can menu dive on your right side. The only thing is, it is typical Olympus fashion. You can end up having to menu dive quite a bit to get into a specific function that you need to change. Like you might end up, going from one page into the next, and next thing you know, you're 3 pages deep and you probably haven't found the setting you want to change yet. So yeah, it's all right. It's what you expect from Olympus. Shooting with the E-PL2, image quality and autofocus. This is where things also continue getting a bit dicey. Again, the camera features a 12 megapixel CMOS sensor, so no CCD goodness here. But let me preface this by saying, things are not bad. Resolution, totally fine. 12 megapixels, I find, is still a reasonable spot for Micro Four Thirds if you don't need a huge amount of cropping power. When it comes to pixel level sharpness, the sensor does have a weak AA filter. Again, this is a camera pre-filterless sensors, so it's just kind of expected for the era of camera that we're talking about. Now, where you'll feel this camera is the dynamic range and high ISO performance. Even if you're used to shooting older DSLRs, this might feel a little worse than even those. But, if you go back really far to like a DSLR from like 2006 or whatnot, then you might not notice going to a camera like this. But coming from modern mirrorless cameras or just full frame cameras in general, you will notice the difference in dynamic range and high ISO performance. I notice this primarily when I'm editing RAWs and I try to expose for the, and when I'm shooting, I try to generally expose for the highlights and try to pull up the image. But even at base ISO, if you're shooting a particularly tough scene and you need to pull up a lot in post, you will quickly notice shadow noise come in. This can be addressed somewhat with modern noise reduction, but it is, worse than what I'm used to. And I'm used to quite some ugly noise from some older sensors. And, we'll have some noise samples in a second. But I do want to say that if you are shooting this camera for noise purposes, it's probably good to keep it at 1600 ISO or lower, and to be much more mindful about the exposure than you normally would be on a more modern camera. One saving grace of this camera is the IBIS. It is not a 5-axis system. It's an older one, so don't expect a billion stops of stabilization, but it is helpful, and it does help you minimize the usage of high ISO. Now, These older 12 megapixel micro four thirds sensors were not bad, but I personally think for the sweet spot for micro four thirds was the introduction of that 16 megapixel unit. Most of the 16 megapixel unit ones are a pretty big jump up in terms of dynamic range and high ISO. Even the first iteration of the 16 megapixel sensor is a considerable boosty from these 12 megapixel ones. Plus, you get the extra resolution goodness. When it comes to autofocusing with the E-PL1, so the system is perfectly fine. It uses, again, 11 boxes that are spread out, and they're clustered generally in the center. They are kind of chunky boxes, though. I'll see if I can I'll pull it up so you can have an idea. There it is. Let's see if you can see it. Oh, that went away. There we go. They are chunky boxes, and it is contrast detect only, and it's not like the Panasonic DFD system. It is quite a bit slower, and these are really not very good at continuous focus tracking. But I found that generally with most static or slow things, it was fairly all right. Now, the benefit of the contrast detect system is that it's fairly accurate when it does get a hold of the thing that you want it to focus on, but in low light, the system does kind of hunt quite a bit. Now, that being said, I mentioned before, the frame rate in low light is at least well maintained, so if the focus isn't successful, you could do a manual punch in and manual focus to try to still get that shot. That being said, if you do decide you need to shoot some speedy shots off and you need to get a whole bunch rattled out, the camera will offer you 3 FPS for 10 RAWs. And let's have a listen. Now, as you can see, mine didn't quite make it to 10 RAWs, but anyways, that's all right. And when it comes to the shutter sound, I honestly think that the camera sounds okay. It's not my favorite. I think the pitch is kind of a bit high, and you can kind of feel the shutter a little more than what you'd think given the size of the camera. So, it's an okay sound. video mode. Right. So this thing does shoot 720p, 30 FPS, and yeah, the video is not really a selling point for this thing nowadays. Even for casual shooting, you're much better off going with any reasonably modern smartphone. But for those of you who are curious, I will put some samples in this video coming up next. Recommendation and conclusion. This is where things get kind of difficult. But before we get into it, let's talk about the easy thing. Average sale price of an E-PL2. It looks like at the time of this recording, for me, very late 2024, the E-PL2 body only can be had for as low as 90 USD, but more commonly for around 120 USD on the E of base. Now, if you're willing to spend a little more money, around 140 USD, you can find E-PL2s which have a kit lens, which is a good deal if you don't have them in any Micro Four Thirds lenses to put on there and just want to get started with a nice combo to shoot pretty quickly. Now, that said, if you look locally, I'm pretty sure you can find one of these things for a lot less. These cameras were reasonably successful at their actual goal of attracting people away from point and shoot cameras. And, at this point in time, many of those owners have likely forgot about this thing until, they find it in a cupboard somewhere and put it up online, having put very few clickies on them. Before buying this E-PL2, I noticed on the local marketplace there was also an E-PL1 posted for even less money. And some of you may have remembered in the past, I got an E-PL5 for a really low price locally. And most of the sales descriptions usually go, bought this camera new some time ago, no longer use it, taking up space. And, it's a good way to find, if you find one of these, it's a good way to get a cheap E-PL series camera. Now, with price out of the way, I think that, if you're looking for an E-PL2, you should be someone that is looking for something that's very cheap, very compact, and, if you're looking for a camera like that, this could be a potentially fantastic deal, since when you combine this with a prime lens, it is fantastically small. Again, I think it can potentially fit in a fairly moderate jacket pocket or a really tiny camera bag, and all for under $200 if you get it with like the Olympus 17mm f2.8 like I have. And that gives you a full frame field equivalent of roughly 34 millimeters, which I think is a pretty nice walk around focal length. With this combo, there's some compromise though, like you don't really get an EVF, and if that's a deal breaker, you could consider buying the external clip-on EVF. But if that is an option for you, that would greatly increase the purchase cost. The EVFs typically go for around 120 USD, depending on which version you get. And you lose that compactness. It is quite a bit chunkier when you add it on. And honestly, at that point, it is about the same size as the EM5 Mark I, and altogether, probably more expensive than the EM5 Mark I. But if you're okay with no EVF and you just want a compact, cheap setup that works with the smaller primes, E-PL2 is a good buy. Now, this brings me to another important thing to consider for alternatives if you want a Micro Four Thirds camera at a similar price range, but want an EVF. Since there are similar cameras with the same or very similar 12 megapixel sensors, and their going rate is about the same as the E-PL2. Now, why would you want an EVF? Well, maybe because composing via the rear fixed screen isn't something you're comfortable with, or maybe you want to do something like play with adapted lenses, and in that case, using an EVF with punch and zoom at eye level would probably help you nail critical focus compared to doing it from the back of the LCD. For whatever reason, the cameras that come to mind instantly are the Panasonic G1 or G2 series cameras. These can be had for about the same price as the E-PL2, and they have built-in EVFs. They also have articulating rear LCD screens, which allow for more flexible composition. And lastly, the slightly larger body of those cameras means that you get more dedicated controls and real command dials. And also generally better ergonomics. However, there are three main downsizes. That is size. They are bigger since they have a built-in EVF. The G1 and G2 don't have IBIS. And the build quality of the G1 and G2 is lackluster compared to the E-PL2. So, it's not as clear-cut a choice, but I would personally take the Panasonic offering if I had to choose between the two. But wait, there's more. If you are patient and you can stretch your budget to literally just $130, I found that you can actually buy a Panasonic G3, and this has some big benefits. As I mentioned earlier, this 12 megapixel sensor is fine, but the next generation sensor, the 16 megapixel unit, again, even in its first iteration, was a big step up. And again, you get your better ISO, better dynamic range, and resolution boosting, which is always nice. And all for literally just a few more dollars. Now, it gets a little bit complicated as the G3 has the same pitfalls as the G1 and the G2, but that sensor is really, really much nicer. And, if you're not that concerned with compactness and you're not that invested in the sleekness of the E-PL2, then I personally think the G3 is a better overall package if you can look over the lack of IBIS. And with that, I think I'm ready to wrap up this video. What do you think of the E-PL2 or the E-PL series in general? I personally actually like my E-PL10, and I hope that OM System will go back to making some entry-level product at some point. And, who knows? Maybe they're cooking up some sort of replacement for the quite old Pen F Digital. I hope so. But do you agree with my recommendations? Do you have anything else you'd recommend in place of an E-PL2? As always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe a super thanks if you're into that. Till next time, bye.